took 8 years to build, more than 2,000 days of construction, an investment of 6.4 billion Canadian dollars, paid entirely, not partially, not mostly entirely, by the government of Canada, to erect what is now the longest cable-stayed bridge span in North America, a structure that sweeps 1.5 miles across the Detroit River on 2 towers the height of a 70-story skyscraper, connecting the heart of the American automobile industry to the heart of the Canadian automobile industry over a waterway through which billions of dollars in trade flow every single day. The cables hold, the concrete is cured, the toll systems are tested, the customs plazas are staffed, the highway connections on both sides are built and graded and ready. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is finished. And it is sitting there, complete and idle, caught in the middle of something that has nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with a relationship between two of the closest neighbors on Earth that has deteriorated into something that would have been unimaginable to describe 4 years ago. Because on the evening of February 9th, 2026, President Donald Trump opened his Truth Social application and did something that even the people who thought they understood his negotiating style did not see coming. He threatened to block a bridge that his own administration endorsed, that Michigan already co-owns, that Canada paid for completely, and that was days away from opening after nearly a decade of construction. He said he would not allow it to open. He said the United States gets absolutely nothing from it. He said he deserves at least half of it. And then, in the same post, he said that if Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made a trade deal with China, the first thing China would do is terminate all ice hockey being played in Canada and permanently eliminate the Stanley Cup. That is a direct quote. And the moment that post landed, something shifted in the story. Not just in Canada, not just in Michigan, not just in the trade war that has been grinding through North American supply chains for the past year, but in the global story of how smaller nations respond when the most powerful country on Earth decides to use its weight as a weapon. Because Canada's response was not what anyone predicted. And what it tells you about where this relationship is heading, and what it tells you about a new kind of sovereignty politics that is reshaping the architecture of North American and global trade, is more important than any single bridge ever built. To understand why this bridge matters so much more than its cost, or its cables, or its daily truck count, you have to understand what it was built to replace and who fought to stop it from being built at all. In 1929, a privately owned toll bridge opened over the Detroit River, the Ambassador Bridge. It was financed by private capital because no government was willing to foot the bill, and it passed through decades of ownership until 1979, when the Morown family of Detroit purchased it and turned it into one of the most valuable private infrastructure assets in North America. The Ambassador Bridge does not look like what you would design today if you were designing a border crossing from scratch. It connects to city streets on the Canadian side, not highways. Trucks crossing the Ambassador Bridge must navigate traffic lights, residential intersections. The infrastructure of a mid-century urban neighborhood in Windsor that was not designed for the volume of 18-wheelers that now crawl through it daily. Over 8,000 trucks use the Ambassador Bridge every single day. It handles approximately 1/4 of all annual trade between the United States and Canada, a staggering proportion for a single privately owned structure nearly 100 years old. The Detroit-Windsor corridor through which it runs manages more than 4 million truck crossings annually and nearly $70 billion in two-way trade. In 2022, a convoy protest blockaded the Ambassador Bridge for days. The disruption sent shockwaves through just-in-time automotive supply chains on both sides of the border. Assembly lines in Michigan and Ontario slowed or stopped because the single artery connecting them was blocked. That event, more than anything, demonstrated what every Canadian strategic planner had understood since 2001. A single, privately owned crossing was a vulnerability that one bad week could exploit catastrophically. Canada had been pushing for a new publicly owned bridge for decades, and for decades it ran straight into the Morown family, which understood perfectly well that a competing crossing would dilute the Ambassador Bridge's monopoly and fought the project through every available legal mechanism. Lawsuits against the state of Michigan, lawsuits against the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, a 2012 Michigan ballot initiative funded to the tune of $30 million to block the crossing agreement, which failed. Years of property litigation, injunctions, delays. The construction timeline stretched from 2018 all the way to 2026. And through all of it, Canada decided that rather than wait for American federal or state funding that might never materialize, Michigan's state legislature had repeatedly declined to contribute. It would pay for the entire thing itself. Every dollar of the 6.4 billion Canadian that built the Gordie Howe International Bridge came from the Canadian federal government. The agreement with Michigan was clear and legally binding. Canada pays for construction and recoups through tolls. After the construction costs are recovered, toll revenue splits 50-50 with Michigan. Michigan gets half the asset without having spent a single cent building it. Former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, who signed the 2012 binational agreement that made the project possible, wrote an op-ed after Trump's post describing Trump's claims about the bridge as incorrect, and calling the original arrangement one of the best deals Michigan ever made. None of that history was in Trump's Truth Social post on February 9th. What was in the post were claims that Canada built the bridge with virtually no U.S. content, that the United States gets absolutely nothing from the arrangement, that President Obama stupidly gave Canada a waiver to avoid Buy American Act requirements, and that this proves Canada has been taking advantage of America, and the demand that Trump would not allow the bridge to open until the United States was fully compensated for everything we have given them, and that the United States should own perhaps at least one half of this asset. The claim about no U.S. content was immediately contradicted by every official with direct knowledge of the project. Ontario Premier Doug Ford told reporters directly, 75% of the steel and concrete was Canadian because Canada is paying for it. 25% was American. The Michigan interchange on the American side, the 3 kilometers of I-75 improvements, the 12 new bridges in the Delray neighborhood, the U.S. Port of Entry Customs facility, was built entirely with American workers, American steel, and American concrete. Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkins confirmed to CNN that thousands of U.S. workers helped build the American side, and that lots of U.S. steel was used. The claim that the United States gets absolutely nothing ignored the binding legal agreement under which Michigan already holds 50% co-ownership. But here is the detail that cut through all the policy discussion and landed in a single devastating line of reporting from ProPublica. Hours before Trump posted his Truth Social attack on the Gordie Howe Bridge, billionaire Matthew Morone, the son of the late Matty Morone, the current custodian of the Ambassador Bridge empire, met with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in Washington. Lutnick then spoke with Trump by phone. Less than a month before Trump's announcement, Morone had donated $1 million to MAGA Inc., a Trump-affiliated super PAC. The House Oversight Committee's ranking member Robert Garcia opened a formal investigation into Lutnick's meeting with Morone and sent the Commerce Secretary a letter requesting all communications related to the exchange. Jeff Watson, who represented the Windsor area as a conservative member of the Canadian Parliament for 11 years, said in a message to CNN, "The absurdity is Trump 1.0 takes no issue with the arrangement, wants construction expedited, while Trump 2.0 now wants to use it as leverage in a trade war he started, and Trump 1.0 did indeed take no issue with the arrangement." In February 2017, Trump issued a joint statement with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in which they said, "Given our shared focus on infrastructure investments, we look forward to the expeditious completion of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, which will serve as a vital economic link between our two countries." That is in the official White House record. Trump did not mention it in his February 2026 post. The morning after the post, Canada's Prime Minister did something that cut against the template of how targeted countries usually respond to Trump's social media attacks. Mark Carney did not issue a retaliatory statement. He did not summon the American ambassador. He did not hold a press conference to denounce the interference. He called Trump directly early on Tuesday morning, and he talked to him, not as a supplicant explaining why he deserved better treatment, not as an adversary issuing counter threats. He called as a head of government who had done his homework and was prepared to walk through the facts calmly and systematically in a way that left no room for the misunderstanding to persist. Carney told Trump that Canada had paid $4 billion for the construction of the bridge. He told Trump that ownership was already shared between the state of Michigan and the government of Canada under the 2012 crossing agreement. He told Trump that the construction of the bridge used Canadian and American steel and Canadian and American workers. He framed the bridge as, quote, "a great example of cooperation between our countries." He said he looked forward to it opening. Carney then reported to journalists afterward that the conversation had been positive. He said the issue would be resolved and would be folded into the broader trade negotiations between the two countries that are already underway under the customer review process. He noted that Trump had appropriately asked his ambassador Pete Hoekstra, a former Michigan congressman who knows this file intimately, to play a role in smoothing the conversation around the bridge. And then, because Canada had a women's hockey game to play against the United States that same day, Carney told Trump that Canada's women's hockey team was going to beat the Americans. It was the precise kind of move, the needle embedded in a handshake, that defines the new Carney diplomatic style and that bewildered the White House more than any counter-tariff could have. But here is where the unexpected part of Canada's response goes beyond the composure of a single phone call, because that phone call was only the most visible layer of something that has been building for the entire year of the Trump-Carney relationship, and what it reveals about where Canada is going is genuinely unprecedented in the modern history of U.S.-Canadian relations. When Mark Carney was elected Prime Minister in June of 2025, he inherited a country that had been subjected to a sustained campaign of economic and rhetorical pressure from Washington, unlike anything in the post-war era. Trump had used an emergency declaration to impose sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods. By August 2025, those tariffs had been raised to 35% on large categories of Canadian exports. He had repeatedly suggested, publicly and without apparent irony, that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. He referred to Canadian prime ministers as governor. He posted altered maps of North America in which Canada was shaded the same color as the United States. He threatened to use economic force to achieve what military force would be unnecessary for. The calculation behind all of this, from the American strategic perspective, was relatively straightforward. Canada is the most dependent on the United States of any advanced economy in the world. Nearly 80% of Canadian exports go to the United States. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. The two economies are so intertwined, $6.4 trillion in total annual trade, $2.7 billion crossing the border every single day, that conventional strategic logic suggested Canada had no viable path other than accommodation. You do not have real leverage when 80% of your exports go to one buyer. Mark Carney does not accept that logic, and the evidence for that rejection is not rhetorical, it is behavioral. It is a series of decisions and moves that, assembled together, reveal a strategic coherence that has surprised analysts both friendly and hostile to Canada's position, and that has begun to force a reassessment of what Canada's real negotiating weight actually is. The first and most significant of those moves happened in January of 2026, when Carney flew to Beijing. He became the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China since 2017. He walked through a park in the capital with Chinese officials and emerged with what he described as a new strategic partnership and a series of tariff reduction agreements. Under the deal, China and Canada cut tariffs on each other's goods in several key sectors. China's punitive 100% tariff on Canadian canola oil was lifted. Chinese tariffs on Canadian lobster, crab, peas, and several other agricultural products were suspended through at least the end of 2026. In return, Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles was restructured, not eliminated but reduced to 6.1% for an initial annual cap of 49,000 vehicles, growing to 70,000 over 5 years. Carney described the deal as unlocking more than $7 billion in export markets for Canadian farmers, ranchers, and fish harvesters. Trump initially responded on social media by saying that's what he should be doing, adding it's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. Within days, Trump reversed course entirely, threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if the deal continued, and posted that China is successfully and completely taking over the once great country of Canada. The Stanley Cup post followed shortly after. The whiplash was visible. But what Carney had actually done, beneath the noise of Trump's social media reaction cycle, was something structural. He had begun the process of diversifying Canada's export relationships in a way that no Canadian Prime Minister had moved to do in a generation. Not because he wants to decouple from the United States. He has been consistently clear that the US-Canada relationship remains Canada's most important bilateral relationship, but because the credibility of every negotiating position Canada holds in its conversations with Washington depends on Washington believing that Canada has alternatives. An economy with one customer is an economy without leverage. An economy actively building a second customer is an economy that can say no. Carney had already planted that flag at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, in a speech that was watched more closely in foreign policy circles than its setting might suggest. Standing before an audience of global business leaders and government officials, he said, "We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically." He called on what he described as the middle powers of the world to rally together in unpredictable times. He did not name the United States. He did not need to. Trump, speaking on the sidelines of Davos the same day, told reporters, "Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements." Trump then revoked Canada's invitation to join his Board of Peace, an international diplomatic forum Trump was assembling. None of these escalations changed Carney's behavior. He announced in Davos that Ottawa would seek to advance trading relationships with global giants including India, ASEAN, and the South American trade bloc Mercosur. He went to Beijing anyway. He took Trump's call about the bridge and corrected him calmly and factually. He tied the bridge into the broader CUSMA trade renegotiation, which is scheduled for 2026, and positioned it not as a separate crisis, but as one item in a comprehensive package of issues that need resolution between two countries that share an economic relationship of staggering depth and mutual dependence. And then, while all of this was playing out in the diplomatic arena, Canada made sure Washington understood something about the actual numbers that underpin this conversation. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada. 85% of U.S. electricity imports come from Canada. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the United States. The two economies are not in a relationship where one partner can be pressured indefinitely without that pressure boomeranging. When Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who had been one of the most consistently pro-engagement Canadian politicians on the file, finally hit the limit of his patience with Trump's tariffs, he did something that got Washington's attention in a different kind of way. Ontario banned the sale of American alcohol. Thousands of bottles of American whiskey, American wine, American beer disappeared from LCBO shelves. It was a symbolic act, but it landed in American producer communities in Kentucky and Tennessee and California as a signal that the patience of Canadian counterparts, who had been most inclined toward accommodation, was running out. Canadian travelers stopped going to the United States. Statistics Canada reported that border crossings by Canadians into the United States were down approximately 30% at land crossings and 25% at airports. American businesses and border communities, hotels, restaurants, retail, felt it immediately. The tourism industry and destinations that had historically drawn large Canadian visitor volumes began reporting revenue shortfalls that were directly attributable to the deterioration of the relationship. The economic pain of the trade war is not flowing in one direction. It never was going to. This is the economic context in which the Gordie Howe Bridge standoff is still, as of May 3, 2026, unresolved. The bridge is built. It is complete. It is in the testing and commissioning stage. The toll rates have been announced, $5.75 per passenger vehicle compared to $10 at the Ambassador Bridge, $8.75 per commercial axle compared to $20 at the Ambassador Bridge. The Gordie Howe Bridge will cost roughly half what the Ambassador Bridge charges, and it will provide direct highway-to-highway connections that the Ambassador Bridge, for all its history and volume, cannot offer. The industrial real estate market in the Detroit metro area has already priced in the bridge's opening. Available industrial land near Detroit Metro Airport has dropped from 6,000 acres a decade ago to 2,000 acres today, as logistics and manufacturing developers built their business plans around the new crossing. The automotive industry, which relies on just-in-time supply chains that cross the Detroit River multiple times per vehicle in various component forms, has been waiting for this bridge to open, to reduce its exposure to the single-point vulnerability of the Ambassador Bridge. And it is still not open, not because there is anything wrong with the bridge, because Pete Hoekstra, the U.S. ambassador to Canada and the former Michigan congressman who was appointed specifically because of his knowledge of this bilateral file, told Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Republican House Speaker Matt Hall in late April 2026 that the Trump administration has not yet reached an agreement with Canada about the opening, but that the issue will get worked out. He just cannot say when. What Trump's team wants, according to the White House official who spoke on background, is for the United States to own at least half the bridge, have shared authority over what passes across it, and participate in the economic benefits generated by its use. The problem with that demand is that the United States, through the state of Michigan, under the legally binding 2012 crossing agreement, already owns half the bridge. Michigan already shares authority over what crosses it. Michigan is already entitled to 50% of net toll revenues after Canada's construction costs are repaid. The deal was structured by a Republican governor of Michigan who signed it on behalf of the state in 2012 as one of the best arrangements Michigan ever made. Get half of a multi-billion-dollar asset built entirely at another country's expense. What the Trump administration appears to want is an accelerated share of toll revenues before Canada's construction costs are fully recovered, effectively demanding that Canada surrender part of the repayment mechanism that makes the investment financially viable in the first place. Carney's position, stated clearly and without ambiguity, is that the bridge was built under a legal agreement. The terms of that agreement are binding. And the appropriate venue for discussing modifications is the broader CUSMA trade negotiation that is already scheduled for 2026. He has not said no. He has said, "Talk to our trade negotiators, it goes in the package. That framing is itself a form of power. The bridge is not a crisis to be resolved under duress. It is an agenda item in a structured negotiation between two sovereign states, and the word sovereign is doing increasing work in the Canadian political vocabulary this year in ways it had not done since the FTA debates of the 1980s. The elbows-up mentality that the University of Windsor's Centre for Cities described as having taken hold across Canadian society is not a media construct. It is a documented behavioral shift. Canadians are boycotting American goods. The Atlantic provinces have turned toward European trade connections that had been dormant for decades. Quebec is looking at French-speaking networks in Africa and Europe as alternative markets for its industrial output. Alberta, whose energy industry is the most exposed to American tariffs and the most traditionally pro-American integration of any Canadian province, has nonetheless seen its premier rally behind national economic sovereignty positions that the province's political culture would have rejected 5 years ago. There is a national conversation happening in Canada about what the country actually is, about whether its identity as essentially an extension of the American economic system was a choice or a circumstance, and about what it would mean to be genuinely independent in the 21st century. Mark Carney did not create that conversation, but he is leading it. And his management of the bridge crisis, calm, factual, unhurried, tie it to the package, call Trump and correct him with courtesy and evidence, let Michigan Republicans who understand what that crossing means to their own state speak in Canada's defense, is the tactical expression of a larger strategic patience that has wrong-footed every expectation of how Canada would respond to sustained American pressure. The bridge will open. Everyone who understands the trade flows and the legal agreements and the political economy of the Michigan-Ontario automobile corridor understands that the bridge will open because it must open. The corridor handles nearly $70 billion in annual two-way trade. Michigan co-owns the bridge. Michigan Republicans have publicly condemned Trump's threat. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat, has been vocal about the economic importance of the crossing to her state. Every automotive company operating just-in-time supply chains across the Detroit River is lobbying for the opening. The commercial logic is overwhelming, but the when is still genuinely uncertain, and the uncertainty itself has cost. Every month that bridge sits in testing and commissioning rather than operational service is a month that the commercial cases built around its opening generate no returns, that the tolls that would begin repaying Canada's $6.4 billion investment sit uncollected, that the competitive pressure on the Ambassador Bridge that would have begun benefiting American truck operators and automotive companies continues to be delayed. The people absorbing those costs are not diplomats. They are truckers and logistics operators and auto parts manufacturers and small businesses on both sides of the river who had planned their expansion strategies around a bridge that is sitting there, finished and idle, in a standoff that has no rational economic justification. This is what it looks like when a trade war collides with a piece of infrastructure that exists at the exact intersection of two countries' economic interdependence. The Gordie Howe Bridge is not just a crossing. It is the physical manifestation of a relationship that moves $2.7 billion of goods across a river every 24 hours, that binds 36 American state economies to Canadian purchasing power, that flows 60% of American crude imports northward to southward through pipelines and tankers that no tariff schedule and no truth social post can change. And what Canada has understood, and what Mark Carney has been patient enough to let the math demonstrate rather than the rhetoric proclaim, is that the leverage in that relationship is not as asymmetric as Washington's posture assumes. An economy that supplies 60% of your crude oil, 85% of your electricity imports, and the largest share of your steel, aluminum, and uranium, and that absorbs the exports of 36 of your 50 states, is not a subordinate economy. It is a partner economy. And you do not block bridges in partner relationships without the costs finding their way back to you. The announcement of that fact, the demonstration of it in fact rather than in words, the patience to let the bridge sit finished in the cold Detroit River wind while the negotiation finds its level in the proper forum. That is the unexpected response, not a counter-threat, not a dramatic pivot. A steady, factual, elbows-up insistence that Canada knows what the deal says, knows what the bridge is worth, and is prepared to wait until Washington is ready to negotiate in good faith about the rest of it. The bridge will open. The question is, what kind of relationship it opens into? And that question is being answered one careful conversation at a time by a prime minister who called the president, corrected him politely, mentioned that Canada was going to win the hockey game, and hung up the phone.